to episode 5 of the Marketing Minutes. I'm Nick Agafonoff and I'm here with Rigas Harbilas. We're from the Practice Insights, and today we're going to be discussing the marketing of women, and not just the marketing of women in this instance, but also the gender pay gap. How do we address something like the gender pay gap, which has been identified as a major issue in Western societies? How do we address that from a research perspective? So what would researchers do in order to solve this problem? So Rigas is going to be discussing this particular issue today. Another topic that we're going to discuss today is the marketing of women in sport in particular. In Australia, we've had the phenomenon of the national women's soccer team, the Matildas they're called, and they've become supremely popular. Recently in the World Cup, the Matildas' ratings were absolutely through the roof. And as a result of this, there's been a lot of discussion around, well, what is the potential? What is the real value of women's sports for marketing and for business? And the final topic we're going to discuss today is the Barbie movie. The Barbie movie has been described by some people as the greatest advertisement for Barbie dolls and products ever. On the other hand, it's also been critically acclaimed, and it's been a cultural marvel in the sense that you had suddenly this rebirth of this iconic idea of Barbie that everybody seemed to embrace, or at least a good portion of young girls and teenagers and their mothers and fathers gravitated toward this movie upon release and been nominated for major awards in cinema. So those are the three topics we're going to be discussing today. And as is the mantra of the Marketing Minutes, what we try to do here is discuss the business side of things, not the politics. Begin with, let's discuss the gender pay gap. Recently, we've had big news from both Mumbrella and the mainstream media about the gender pay gap. And this is nothing new. There's been a persistent gender pay gap for as long as we can remember. But what does a median gender pay gap actually mean from a statistical and mathematical standpoint? What implications does that have for closing the gap? And what are the possible measures that can be undertaken to close the gap from a researcher perspective? And are those measures even possible? So Rigas, let's throw it over to you to begin this discussion. The gender pay gap. How do we solve this problem from a researcher perspective?
Yeah, Lee, you're right. It's been around forever. And one of the things I've always, and of course, there's a lot of political talk about why this has happened, what's happened in the past to keep this going, et cetera, and I think we're going to leave that all behind today. We're not looking at why it's happened or why we're here. There's probably many reasons. Every single one of the reasons that commentators talk about is probably one of the reasons. You know what I mean? I don't think anyone's right or wrong. All of the aggregate reasons are probably the reasons. So that's not the issue. The issue is that these measurements are now taken in large organizations. I believe in businesses that turn over a certain amount of money are participating in this now. And Umbrella reported actually quite transparently on a number of media organizations and marketing organizations, obviously of interest to Umbrella, and they were named. And the gap was in fact printed. You know, this was the gap for this organization. This is the gap for this organization. Some were small, some were 4%, some were 24% gap, you know. But one thing I kind of, and maybe this is not the case because I haven't seen all of the data, of course, but one thing that occurred to me was that it was never the other way around. I don't think there was ever a situation where the pay gap was in the favor of the women in the organization. You know what I mean? So regardless of how big or small the gap was, it was always the women in the organization that seemed to be on the lower end of that. So let's look at it from a cold, hard business statistical point of view as we would as researchers, quite frankly. This is exactly what we would do. It's exactly what our clients would pay us to do, to look at it completely objectively with the hard facts in order to understand what it is and what is the solution. And unfortunately, it's going to bore us with a bit of stats. So let's just go back to the basics. What does a median mean? Because that's what they're reporting. So let's be very specific here. The reporting of the data is on medians, not on averages. I think that's fair enough. I mean, But what does a median mean? Of course, median is Latin. Not that I know any Latin, but I know median means the middle. Organization Acme Media plots the female median salary inside the organization, and for them, it's about 17% lower, which seems to me, when I was reading through those numbers, is probably the average. It's about 15% is the median pay gap roughly across organizations. I think, Nick, something like that. And that's what this means. It means we plot the bell curve of the women's salaries inside the organization, and it looks like that, and it follows roughly the same rules, right? Of a lower median or even average, and but it's still the same rules in terms of 1, 2, 3 standard deviations and the percentage of women in each of those bands. So immediately we can see that, okay, so the median for women is 17% lower, but that doesn't mean that there aren't very highly paid women. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't lower paid men, right? So the median means that it's kind of telling you where the midpoint is. So I've heard some politicians, as a result of, this data getting up, I don't know, it's a media grab, right? Which they need to do for mental availability, but they're saying things like, women earn less than men. Well, yes, sort of in a median sense, but if you look at this intersecting area between the male and female salaries in Acme Media, there's a lot of intersectionality here between men and women. There's a lot of overlap. So we could say there's a majority overlap, to be honest, statistically, right? Where there isn't an overlap is that there's a bigger percentage of women earning, the lower part of the median, and there's a smaller percentage earning the higher part of the median. So you can see this is where the gaps are. They're all over here, right? So what do we want to do? What we need to do, what Acme needs to do, is kind of just literally merge these bell curves, these salary bell curves, so that the medians match up. So in 3 years, when we take measurements again, Acme Media has a little to no pay gap.
So Rigas, as a non-statistical researcher, I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, wouldn't the easiest thing to do would be to reduce the median pay for men and increase the median pay for females? So sort of meet in the middle. Some men lose a little bit, some women gain a little bit, and then you have this equilibrium.
That's right. And in fact, Nick, that is one of the solutions. So might call a 100% staff meeting and say that, look, we don't want this anymore. We want to, for good reason, want to match up these medians, this pay gap. So what we need to come up with a strategy, everyone. So we want everyone to agree that you're right, Nick. Let's say, we will raise all female pay in the organisation by 5%, 7%, and we will lower all male pay in the organisation by 7%. Okay, and that way, next time we take measurements, will be matched. So statistically, mathematically, how we address this is that we do that. Either, there is an increase and a reduction of pay to meet somewhere in the middle so that the medians match up, right? Or Acme Media can't do that. The staff cannot agree to do that. And not only that, some of the staff threaten litigation because it means their salary would drop to below their contracted rate. It does really depend on the agreement of the people inside the organisation. But those are the hard facts. In order to match up the median pay gap between men and women in any one organisation, that organisation is going to both have to raise and lower the salaries of women and men respectively in order to match up the pay gap in the short term. That's what's necessary in order to do it very, very quickly. Because I've read a lot of companies say in response to this, of course, companies are interviewed and the HR people are interviewed, etc. And they keep saying we're doing a lot of work in this space, and which is corporate speak for, I don't know what it means. What do you mean you're doing a lot of work in this space? What are you doing? Because as far as you've just said, there's only about 3 things we can do. We can raise all women's salaries and or lower all men's salaries, right, as you said, to achieve. Or if we can't do that right now and we take a forward-loading approach, which means from now on we're going to correct it, it means in order to correct it even for the next few years, over the next few years, it means that you have to award a disproportionate amount of the higher-paying jobs to women and a disproportionate amount of the lower-paying jobs to men over a 2 to 3 year period at a ratio. I don't know what the ratio would be, but it would be a ratio.
The HR departments, the recruitment strategies, the diversity, inclusion and equity frameworks that have been established for large corporations and governments, all the way down to local governments and even medium-sized organizations, it's very, very clear that there's been a societal push to create equity and equality in terms of recruitment. So I actually don't see there being an obstacle in terms of the Anti-Discrimination Act, an obstacle to rectifying the issue with the median pay gap for women. I think that it would be almost impossible from a social, cultural, and political perspective to be able to prevent it. Maybe legalistically, from a technical point of view, but it would be incredibly unpopular. Incredibly unpopular.
We're talking now about the gender pay gap, right? We're not talking about diversity, inclusivity, and equity across the board. Look, let's look in our industry, right? Our industry. We've got a job for a senior group account manager, research director type person who's going to handle a bunch of clients, a senior job, you're going to have a bunch of people you're working with, the usual thing, right? A couple $100,000 a year, probably around that mark. I think that's where it's at roughly these days. Very senior role, very responsible, good money, all of that sort of stuff, right? So are you seeing anywhere that, the ad saying, and by the way, we will give priority to a female applicant for this particular one? Or, for example, the alternative job inside that media organization, which might be some kind of assistant who's going to be on the lower side of the median pay, right? When they're advertising for that job, have you seen an ad that says, and by the way, we are really looking to recruit a man for this particular job in our organization because we need more men on, in the lower pay gap, lower pay bands? Have you seen an ad like that?
You would never see an ad like that because it would be considered discriminatory.
Right. But in order to match the bell curves, that's what has to happen. So my senior director roles, if I'm the owner of the organization, the next 2 out of 3 senior director roles that come up for grabs, not should be given to women, not should be, must be. Must be. Otherwise, I'm not going to get my bell curves matched up. And similarly, the graduate jobs coming out of uni, the research assistant jobs, etc., the project manager jobs, have to, the next 3 out of those, the 2 of them must be given to men. Not should be. Forget the should, because these gaps are all about, these gaps are the result of people saying what we should be doing. That's all they have. These gaps are the result of people saying what we should be doing without doing anything. It's not what I should be doing. Acme Media must do that to bridge the gaps, or they must call all the staff in and do the pay thing. But even if they do the pay thing, all the salary bands from there on must be equally populated, right? Which means that, let's say there are 4 jobs in the senior roles coming up, you've got to give 2 and 2, because otherwise your equilibriums are going to get out, your survey is going to, right?
The dangers of trying to impose society around a statistical model on a piece of paper is
okay, that's fine, Nick. So what are we arguing about then?
It would also require it to happen across the board. So every single company.
No, they don't. Because you're concerned about Acme Media. The results in Mumbrella were reported according to each company. So each company had a gender pay gap percentage next to it, right? So I don't care if my competitor, X Media, has a gender pay gap, right? I couldn't care less about them. I don't want one. In Acme Media, that's my organization, I don't want one. Or there's a public company organization and they don't want one, right? And in fact, they might even see it as a competitive advantage if they can publish the fact that they don't have a gender pay gap. You see what I mean? And our competitor does. You see what I mean? So it's it could actually be commercially beneficial in pitching for work even. We keep talking about it, and then when the cold, hard mathematical reality of what needs to happen in order to bridge this gap becomes apparent, everyone puts their hands up and says, oh, no, we can't do that. That's all I'm saying.
In terms of sport in the Australian context, we've had leagues like the NRL, the rugby league, the AFL really dominate the commercial space and ratings with men's sport in that regard, and also the Australian cricket team. But in the last decade or so, women's sport has started to really emerge, and we're talking about the Matildas in the area of soccer, and also the Australian female cricket team as well. And then we've also had new leagues established like the AFLW, which is the Australian Football League, but for women. In recent years, just in terms of the gender pay cap, for instance, the Australian Open tennis has the same prize money for both men and women.
Oh.
So we've seen the emergence of women's sport, but what we haven't seen in particular until very recently has just been this phenomenon of popularity for the Matildas. This occurred recently around the World Cup, and ratings went through the roof. And from an ethnographic point of view, I observed lots of people in my own community getting into it as households, a lot of men with daughters following the prospects of the Matildas. And we're talking about a team here that isn't even the number one. It's not like the Australian Matildas soccer team is dominating the sport globally. They're in the top 10 teams in the world. Australians have typically loved, winners. They love it when the Australian cricket team dominates all of the other teams. They love it when the Wallabies are actually beating the All Blacks, which hasn't been happening for a while. So look, the Matildas are in the top 10 and they're very competitive, but they're incredibly popular at the moment. And so there's been this discussion, this discourse emerging, which is, well, actually, the Matildas should be getting paid as much as the Socceroos. Also, marketers, companies should be getting behind the Matildas in terms of sponsorship and marketing the sport. And in fact, there's been a number of big articles written, one recently in the Financial Review in Australia, discussing that actually, marketers really should be taking advantage of this rise in popularity of women's sport in general.
I do play a lot of soccer on EA Sports, the game. I like that.
Do you play with the women's team on EA Sports?
Of course. And the Australian women's team very, very frequently, even though, like you said, they're hard. It's hard to beat England and America with the Australian women's team on EA Sports, even though I'm not the best player or anything, but it is harder, right? And so we love winners when it comes to our national sports like cricket and rugby and all that kind of stuff. We have to win those, swimming even, right? We've got to win those because they're Aussie sports. You know what I mean? They're really Australian sports. But now, soccer, as we know, is kind of got more imported out of Europe. It took a long time, and it's still the underdog. But interestingly, I also noticed. Remember when the Australian men's team at the World Cup? Yeah, I mean the Australians really get behind that as well, to be honest, right? So even though we know we're not going to get maybe in the rounds of 16. Australians really get invested in it, even with the blokes. And I think it's the same. And you're right, the same phenomenon happened this time with the Matildas. So I think what we're seeing in the realm of soccer, which has always been the underdog sport, and so is it possible, Nick, that because soccer has always been on the cultural outer, in a sense, in Australia, that it was easier, in a sense, for women to enter that arena where it's on the cultural outer and kind of become more dominant in that arena because it wasn't already dominated by men? Do you know what I mean? Like rugby league, AFL, cricket. I know, of course, there are great women's teams in those as well, but of course, it's the emotional imprint is dominated very much by men. And of course, soccer was always men, but because it was culturally on the outer, maybe that gave it a kind of what we call in marketing white space. Maybe there was white space in soccer for, women's team to really get up there and become, to your point, equally well known and loved as the male team as far as the national soccer team is concerned, which you can't really say the same for the other sports. I don't think that the women's cricket team or the women's rugby team or the women's whatever team, AFL team is as loved as the male counterpart team, if you like. I'm not even sure if they're seen in the same way. Whereas with the Matildas, most definitely. And of course, we're always looking at the business side of things. So I am, because I'm not really invested in sport that much. So I always look at sport in terms of money and business. I think the Matildas have huge sponsorship, don't they? I mean, I think you rattled off some companies before, Nick, like Commonwealth Bank, the big one, Commonwealth Bank, Nike, Qantas, right? They're big. Right, they're blue. I mean, that's blue chip sponsorship, right? I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And then, you know, down to, okay, Rebel, get it? I kind of get it, Rebel, absolutely. You know, but then Cadbury, Subway. So as an organization, they're drawing in money, and they're clearly making money because they got sponsors, because that's what a football team is all about, right? It's drawing in money through your sponsors, through the television rights, through everything, right? Through every single conceivable mechanism. A football team costs so much money to run that it needs massive amounts of money. Look, I'm looking at these sponsors and I'm saying, wow, I mean, they must have more sponsorship than the male team, Nick. I don't know. But to your point, the female team is probably making more money as an organization than the Australian male national team.
I think that's quite
Would that be
possible,
true?
Regis. Yeah, I think it's quite possible.
It's possible, isn't it? Yeah.
The issue here is that I think the Matildas are getting better support and sponsorship, and marketers and businesses are getting behind it. In fact, a lot has been written about the only thing that prevents women's sport from being successful as a marketing tool is the idea of getting behind it. You know, that businesses need to get behind it with sponsorship. You need to get behind it as marketers. You need to create advertising. You need to create marketing events. And in fact, this is something that I want to comment in relation to sport in general, is that sport, professional sport that people watch on TV, traditionally it used to be predominantly men that watched sport. And now we're seeing a lot of women watching sport as well. But sport has traditionally been a very highly produced product. You know, when you talk about the NRL, the number of cameras involved, the special types of cameras and ultra slow-mo and drones, the incredible displays that happen within the stadium, and then all of the peripheral talk shows and media and journalism and advertisement. And they have hype reels before every major game where you have somebody come out and sort of say some sort of poem that's inspirational about these incredible athletes and sets up the game like they're gladiators going head to head. There's this enormous production around sport. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is that in this respect, sport is not a grassroots phenomenon in terms of marketing and in terms of consumption. Okay, sport is actually a major establishment phenomenon. And if you think right back to the Roman days and the gladiatorial ring, it was created by a Roman emperor who invested an enormous amount of resources into this because they knew it would be a fantastic way to create distraction for the population, and it would be a popular thing for the society at the time, and it certainly was, and that has continued. That model has continued on to this day. So the thing is that this is not a grassroots phenomenon. This I guess amplification of women's sport has come from a top-down strategy, and it's effective. It's become very, very effective.
The way you've just described the production of sport, it's like the sport itself is but one small component in that production. Do you know what I mean? The way you just described the production, everything that happens around, what's the game? The game is 90 minutes, right? Yeah. It's 90 minutes plus extra time. So what you've described is hours and days and weeks and months of work and stuff around those 90 minutes.
I'll give you an example from a consumer perspective, okay? So I'm somebody that is a consumer of NRL, the rugby league in Australia. I follow the Canberra Raiders, okay? So what do I consume every week? First of all, I'm reading all of the sports articles in rugby league that are coming up on news websites. Second of all, I have become a member of lots of social media groups associated with the Canberra Raiders. So I get all the Canberra Raiders news I watch all of the videos and the press conference, press releases by the Canberra Raiders during the week. So I'll watch little videos that are produced by the Raiders club themselves, interviews with Ricky Stewart, the coach. I'll read over all the comments online from various fans. I'll contribute to that. I'll then go on to Fox Sports during the week and I'll watch the NRL 360 shows. I'll occasionally watch The Fan and other peripheral shows that are discussing the actual game, different types of issues that are emerging week to week, predicting who's going to win this week or next week, following particular players. It is vast, okay? It's a vast web, vast network, vast industry, right? Just the NRL. And then, of course, there's watching the games, there's watching the highlights from the games, there's watching the debrief commentaries from the games, there's going back and actually watching little clips that I find, this and that. It layers up and up and up and up. And it's a vast amount that I'm consuming. So I'm not just consuming the Canberra Raiders play on Friday night at 6 o'clock in Auckland.
Yeah.
I'm not just consuming that. I'm consuming this enormous consumer culture that is like this vast cloud that surrounds that one piece of the
puzzle. So that's really kind of illuminating it, because I mean what it's basically saying is for that organization, for the Canberra Raiders in the modern game to be a viable, marketable, money-making machine that it is, right? It has to engage in all of this production.
Just as a case in point, in terms of how influential and powerful this marketing opportunity is, Ricky Stewart, the coach of the Canberra Raiders during the week, has come out and implored the ACT government to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a new state-of-the-art stadium that has a roof and all of the accoutrements, and says that Canberra deserves this. Canberra needs this, and it would be an incredible shame if it doesn't. So we're talking about an NRL coach having the power and the influence over local government to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in new infrastructure that would further promote the game.
This is what happens in the United States, where the football teams are so rich, are so powerful, that they actually have these conflicts and blackmail state governments into building new stadiums for them, or at least subsidizing them. Or if they don't, they'll move states. This is not really a grassroots phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that is created, like you've said, from the establishment. So from a marketing angle, how much can marketers use the Matildas, and can the Matildas be stretched across that many brands? This is the other thing. You know what I mean? Like, can this, because the Matildas is a brand, can that brand stretch itself across that many categories and still be effective, as in it's making money for the Commonwealth Bank, it's making money for Nike, it's making money for Rebel, far out, it's even making money for Cadbury, it's even selling some more chocolates for Cadbury. I don't know if it is or if it isn't, but is there too much pressure being put on this brand called the Matildas? You know what I mean? To kind of for marketers, like, is it too obvious? Is it too easy a thing for marketers to latch onto? And therefore, as a result, they become overexposed as a brand in terms of advertising, because they are still a football team.
There's another issue with the Matildas. Well, first of all, they are rating extremely well. So in terms of ratings, television ratings, highest ratings in the last 12 months has been the Matildas game during the World Cup. Okay, that blew every other TV ratings out of the water. So they're rating extremely well. But the issue is with the Matildas is they don't play that often. It's like it's one team.
That's what I was about to say.
And they play
intermittently,
right? As opposed to, say, a gargantuan league like the NRL, where you've got a game on Thursday night, 2 games on Friday night, 3 games on Saturday, and 3 games on Sunday.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got things like the State of Origin series, and you've got internationals as well. So in terms of the ability to put a product out there and have eyeballs looking at the games, looking at all of the sponsorship, imbibing advertising, and anything else that's commercially associated with that game, you've got an enormous number of touch points. Let's put it that way. Enormous number of touch points in terms of what is actually being produced and distributed to audiences.
If I could go back to our dear friends at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute with How Brands Grow, everyone's favorite, every marketer's favorite book. But they're accurate, right? What you've just described, Nick, is physical and mental availability. That's what they would say, right? They would look at look at soccer and say dispassionately, it's a product, right? Mental, physical availability. What you've described is a situation where the Matildas have a humongous mental availability, like awareness is super high, all that kind of stuff, right? But then you just said, however, I can't really consume that product more than 3 times a year, which means its physical availability is absolutely limited, right? Whereas the NRL, but far out. I mean, that's got you've just described the distribution mechanisms for the NRL, and they are the equivalent of Coca-Cola in the world of beverages. Yeah, Coca-Cola has all the distribution muscle, the biggest distribution muscle in the world of beverages. And a lot of people say, even above and beyond our love for the product, that distribution, that physical availability keeps it king, right? So basically, you're describing the NRL as the Coca-Cola of distribution mechanism. So not only does the NRL have the mental availability, they've got the physical product there available for me to consume weekly, and marketing and advertising can therefore be attached to that daily. Actually not even weekly. What you've described as a fan is a daily consumption of the product, almost like a drink, right? Almost like a drink. Whether it's a game, or whether it's a commentary, or whether it's a YouTube video of Ricky Stewart, or whether it's whatever, it becomes a daily consumption event, like a food and beverage. That's what brings it, and so whilst an organization like the Matildas, and this is not just about the Matildas, this happened to men's soccer as well consistently. There's a huge build-up at the World Cup with the men's team, and everyone gets right on board, right? And all the commentators are saying, this is it. This is this is when the grassroots start to swell in Australia, and they don't. Or they kind of have, but because again, I can't consume, because if soccer in Australia is about the Matildas and the Socceroos. It's 2 products, and we can only consume them 3 times a year each. Okay, and then we've got these peak consumption times at World Cups, right? Whereas the NRL is just so many products.
So for many years, the most played sport in Australia was actually netball. And we know that netball never reached any heights in terms of being a product, being a marketable product. But it was the highest attended sport at the grassroots. More people played netball than any other sport, and it's always been followed by soccer, by the way. So the issue here, so once again, this is illustrative that grassroots doesn't really matter in terms of marketing sport. If grassroots was the indicator of popularity of a product on TV that you consume, then the A-League and netball leagues that are shown on television would have incredibly high ratings, but they don't comparatively to the NRL and the AFL. And to a large degree, I think the answer to this is that the sports that most people can't do because they're incredibly athletic, or because they require an enormous amount of skill that the average person doesn't have, or they're incredibly brutal and require an enormous amount of strength and fitness and discipline, are the ones that are popular, all right? They're the ones that belong in the gladiatorial ring of Rome. They're the ones that at a visceral biological level, people want to see the roosters go up against each other in the ring. The biggest roosters, the best performing roosters, and that's an instinctive thing. That's what ultimately is marketable about the NRL and about the AFL. These other sports, which grassroots level sports, like soccer, like netball, only then have salience when they are at an international level. So when they represent the absolute best of the crop, the best 11 soccer players that this country can produce against the best 11 soccer players that another country can produce.
That's exactly right. And if I could just, I don't know if we end this, if I could cycle back around to EA Sports for a second. What I've noticed is that the Australian soccer, because they star rate every single player in EA Sports, they're the actual players. They must have some sort of deal, right, with FIFA. And they star rate every single team and player and whatnot. And what I've noticed, the Australian men's soccer team star rating is not even as high as maybe it's probably as high as the third division teams in the Premier League in England. So not the first, not even the second, you know, how they get relegated from Premier to whatever division there every year, yeah? Not even the second. It's not even there. They wouldn't even compete at the second level. They will probably be competing at the third. So to your point, Nick, yeah, we don't have the we just don't have the bods on the ground at that level for those particular sports to engage at that very, very high level that the teams are playing at, for example, in the English Premier League, right? Where they seem to be playing at a higher skill level. Well, you would know this. You're the soccer player, right?
Absolutely. And the Champions League, which is the league that has the top 3 or 4 teams from each major European league. So from the Premier League,
UEFA,
from
the
the La
UEFA Champions
Liga,
League, yeah.
from the French league,
yeah.
they take all of the best teams and they call it the Champions League, and that is the Premier League in the entire world, right? So you've got eyeballs watching that from all over the world, because those are also the richest clubs in the world. They can afford to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to the top players, right? So it's absolutely encoded in terms of the viewership that you are watching the top gladiators of that sport in the entire world going up against each other.
You said something that's really interesting, which goes against the narrative, Nick, which you've just said, look, the grassroots don't matter that much. I barely knew who David Beckham was apart from a pretty boy soccer player. He played for Manchester United, and people talk about grassroots. The reality is he did play grassroots. He played kids soccer. He was plucked out at age 15 and taken to Manchester United and trained, basically. Finished high school at Manchester United, basically, right?
Some kids are pulled out at 6 or 7 now. Some kids are
at 6 or 7
pulled out in early primary school, and they're moved from their local village in South America or Africa or wherever, and they're actually billeted into a club, like it might be a club like Real Madrid or Barcelona or Manchester United or Manchester City, and they spend their entire lives developing into a professional soccer player.
And the other thing I've noticed with those teams is that how international the English Premier League teams are, Nick. I mean, they're not populated with English blokes. They're not. They're populated with men young men from around the world, like literally around the world. So this whole idea that we need a very strong, boyhood, a lot of boys play, and they do play a lot of soccer in England anyway, boys, but the idea that we need that huge grassroots in order to pluck talent from no longer exists. They're plucking talent from everywhere in the freaking world.
The Canberra Raiders team is made up of New Zealanders, Englishmen, then Australians, but from around the country. And then there's a couple of Canberrans.
A couple of actual Canberrans.
Of token Canberrans.
Basically, look, they just don't necessarily. I mean, they need young men in Australia to be playing soccer and stuff, football and soccer. Yeah, sure, and that's always going to happen at the school level. But the idea that today professional A-level teams need grassroots in which to pluck from, the most talented boys from Canberra. You know what I mean? Like they don't need grassroots soccer football in Canberra. They need grassroots rugby league in Canberra as much as they do in New Zealand and the Cook Islands and the UK, because that's where they're recruiting from, right?
In fact, the NRL has recruitment pathways in Papua New Guinea, in Fiji, in all of those places. They're plucking people out of obscurity and
right.
putting them through a process of training and education and professionalization, because they're product.
It's top-down grassroots, Nick. Yeah, it's product. Exactly. It's a top-down grassroots.
It's a product, Rigas. What are the best products that we have?
Yeah.
Right? The best products that we have, the iPhone, right? The iPhone could not be produced by a small community. The iPhone required a massive infrastructure in order to produce it.
Of course.
And that's what successful sports is as a product. It's something that requires an incredibly
successful infrastructure,
large industrial capacity in order to produce.
In all fairness, all the people who've been calling for the more bigger investment in the marketing of women's sport, that's exactly what they've been saying. What they've been saying is one of the reasons that women's sport is lagging is because you're not making it available as a product for people to consume, right? And people would argue, we don't make it available as a product because it doesn't generate as much money as the men, and we've only got a limited amount of airtime and all that sort of stuff as well. But they also had a point and the Matildas are a case in point, that if you pump enough money and sponsorship and whatever into that, right, and they're a reasonable team, top 10, right, then basically they've shown that, those people were right. If we actually do give this product some physical availability and mental availability, it can be bigger, as proven.
Let's move to our final topic for today, which is the Barbie movie, which was very successful at the box office. I know that my daughter, who was never ever a Barbie fan, never owned a Barbie doll in her life, suddenly wanted to see the Barbie movie. She got together with her girlfriends. They got dressed up in, I guess, Barbie type outfits, and they went along to see the movie, and they loved the movie. It was an empowering movie for young women in terms of its message. The movie then got nominated for lots of Oscars and other awards, and it's been described as a marketing phenomenon, the rebirth of Barbie. But was it just a big advertisement?
Yeah, I mean, that's by the way, I mean, I've spoken to many adults my age who saw the movie and really liked it. Men, women too. They said it was quite good, right? So we're not here to critique the movie in any way. We're here to discuss whether it's actually an advertisement for Barbie dolls. It made money on its own merits as a film and as a product for the people who made the film, and probably for Mattel, the owners of the brand. But did it sell Barbie dolls?
I don't think it was a big advertisement. I think that it was a successful film that managed to use the platform of consumer cultural success and brand saliency of Barbie and Barbie dolls from decades to make a successful film. And the reason I say this is that whilst sales in Barbie dolls increased somewhat, the sales were not dramatic increases. So we don't have clear data on this because Mattel is not releasing the exact figures in terms of increases in sales of dolls. But we're talking about between 10 and 15% increases in sales of Barbie dolls. And if you think about the success of the film, how many people watched it, what it grossed in terms of revenue, etc., you'd think that actually there would be a much larger upsurge in terms of sales of Barbie dolls. So what I'm saying is that there was a memory within the cultural memory of Barbie as a product, as a doll, and that the movie was able to leverage off that cultural memory to make a successful movie, but it hasn't actually resulted in a significant increase in Barbie dolls. In fact, I do believe that the sale of Ken dolls has outstripped actual Barbie dolls.
As a result of that movie, Ken doll sales have outpaced Barbie doll sales as a result of the movies. That's the thesis, yeah? Interesting. I mean, I don't know what the explanation for that might be. We could just talk about Barbie historically for a sec,
Yes.
because I know, you know, it's been a movie for 5 minutes, but it's been a brand for, you know, an extremely long time. It was Barbie was the creation of a lady called Ruth Moskowitz, who was actually born in the early part of the 19th century in America. You know, it was kind of Polish Jewish immigrant parents, the usual American thing. Yeah, and then she married a fellow when she was a student called Izzy Handler, and she became known as Ruth Handler. And Ruth Handler is a credit. Well, she invented the Barbie doll and co-founded with her husband, co-founded Mattel on the basis of the Barbie doll. Apparently, the Barbie doll was modeled on an East German, let's call it soft porn character, cartoon character. I can't remember the name of this. Lily, that was the name of this person, Lily. And it was a cartoon in Germany or something or other. And apparently the rumor goes that Handler modeled Barbie based on that type of character, which is a kind of a strange thing. If I could say, Barbie, or the marketing rules for Barbie at the time followed what you might call like a kind of a feminist narrative, if you like, at the time. So Barbie, it's not a new thing. It's not a new thing that Barbie espouses, espouses a form of feminism, if you might call it that, in the modern era. This is a very old thing for Barbie because there are all these marketing rules about Barbie. For example, Barbie, one of the marketing rules was Barbie could be depicted as a bride, but she could never be a mother or a wife. Interestingly, right? And of course, she could be all these other things. She could be a doctor, and she could, Barbie could be all of these other things. And so the marketing of Barbie was always really, to be honest with you, for want of a better expression, because it's an old expression, but the female empowerment thing, So it's this movie, in a sense, it just basically just picks up on that phenomenon and just drops it into the modern era, and in audiences have said in a very fun type of way, right, as well. So it's not a new positioning for Barbie. That female empowerment, they are pushing the female empowerment line about the movie, or whatever. But it's always been the case with Barbie, which is kind of interesting because I've got 3 daughters, Nick, as you know, and I used to work for a company. I traveled a lot, and I bought Barbies from all around the world. All kinds of Barbies from India, Barbies from Indonesia, but so every culture had Barbies dressed up in their own culture, and it was basically a global phenomenon. So you could be forgiven for thinking that Barbie was like this, and it was a dress-up doll in a way. So literally, little girls would play dress-up with their Barbies. But again, Barbie was always, as they were playing with this, dressing up this doll, they were playing with an independent, autonomous character who was not beholden to or betrothed to a man or anything like that. Do you know what I mean? And Ken was just a sort of an acquaintance in a way. Ken was never the husband or anything like that.
So are you saying that the success of the film can be attributed to it being on code with
100%.
what Barbie has always represented?
It's bang on code. It's not new. And I know, people jump on it and say it's part of a new woke thing or whatever, but it's not. It's not. This has always been the positioning of Barbie. It's always been female empowerment. And Nick, can I say that the generation of girls that grew up playing with Barbie, interestingly, also the most empowered girls in history.
So they've gone on to become doctors and CEOs and political leaders.
Correct. And also have economic independence from men, not needing a husband in order to survive,
playing with dolls, are we saying that is an incredibly powerful thing for children to do, is to have these dolls
I don't know.
and to imagine them as real people, right? Adults, adult versions of themselves, and to create these little scenarios and scenes where they're succeeding as a doctor or they're succeeding as a CEO, that actually being able to encourage children to play, to do make believe with dolls actually has an incredibly powerful impact on what they potentially imagine for themselves in the future.
Well, as they say, children's play is never play, it's rehearsing for life. The whole evolutionary biological argument is why do all young animals play is rehearsal of life. Yeah. And look, and I have no doubt that when my daughters were playing with Barbie dolls at some point in time, Ken and Barbie may have been married in their Barbie home that they had. Maybe they did play that. Maybe they did, but I'll tell you what they didn't have. There were no Barbie children. So I believe, God, this is stretching my memory. I believe Barbie had little friends, but they were like friends and nieces. They weren't her daughter. You know what I mean? So whilst you really had to play make-believe to get Ken and Barbie to be married with a family because there was no evidence of it. You know what I mean? So you couldn't get the little kids in there. Like if you notice with kids' toys, and now we're getting onto kids' toys, but if you notice with kids' toys, that they've got the doll houses, and usually they've got like little kids and babies and children and mums and dads and like a house sort of thing. But Barbie doesn't have that. Barbie's an independent woman, and she always has been from that regard. So, like I said, it's fairly subliminal, and it could be a coincidence, but I don't think it's not. I think it's a cultural thing. It's and okay, and so why is Ruth Handler such a genius? Because she saw this, her and her husband, or the people who are marketing it with her, like were way ahead of their time. I mean, way ahead of their time in terms of their depiction of a young woman in a doll, and you know what I mean. They kind of, it's almost like they could see into the future. It's crazy about what where society was going in terms of gender, and okay, we're back to gender. It's what we're talking about today. So, absolutely genius from that perspective. There's nothing anachronistic about Barbie. Yeah, maybe there was that aspect to it in terms of playing to some sort of body ideal, but the deeper cultural code was that this woman was not just a beauty queen; she was also an independent, intelligent woman off her own bat. Yeah, and so I would say that probably had just as big an impact on young kids playing with the doll as this thing about I can never look like Barbie.
On that note, Rigas, this concludes the Marketing Minutes episode 5. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.